Yeah.
Start the recording. And okay, perfect. Yeah, so we're live now. People should be able to join, and I'm sure they will be happy not to. I know they've been waiting a few minutes, so.
I was getting texts from my friends. I'm worried they had the wrong link. I was like, no, guys, I swear.
No, this doesn't normally happen in person. Just sitting in the room, like, am I in the right place?
Okay.
Okay, so people are kind of filtering in now. So I'll use this opportunity to, I guess, generally introduce this evening's panel. So our panel this evening is on the theme of journalism in times of crisis, inspired by no current events whatsoever. And we're really delighted to have three fascinating, very accomplished journalists here with us this evening to discuss this. We're going to hear from each of them first. We have a few questions prepared, and then we'll open the floor to an audience Q&A later. And this panel sort of tying in with our debate this week, which is on the motion, the sets beliefs that journalism is failing democracy, which will be tomorrow. So it's a very exciting week of journalism-based events. This panel is largely organized by Kate from the Hist department. I'll leave it to Kate to introduce our speakers for this evening.
Yeah, so hi guys, I'm Kate. I am said member from the Ents department. And we're so lucky to have three incredible journalists with us tonight. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but just briefly, we have Gavin Riley and Richard Chambers from Virgin Media News, and we have Aoife Moore from the Irish Examiner. So if you want to start with just a little bit of who you are and your experience over the last year, I'm sure it's been a crazy one for all of you. So if we want to start with Aoife, maybe?
Yeah, so I'm Aoife. I am a political correspondent at the Examiner. I came to the Examiner from Press Association. I was already in Leinster House doing a lot of politics, and then made the jump to the Examiner 4 weeks before lockdown, which was great. So I worked for 2 weeks in Leinster House trying to find my feet. I went to Washington with the Taoiseach to go and meet Donald Trump. And then when we were in Washington, Leo Varadkar closed the schools and we went under lockdown. So I celebrated my work anniversary on Valentine's Day in the Examiner, very romantic. But my entire year in my new job has more or less been in lockdown. So I've had a completely different first year experience that most political correspondents get. I think most political correspondents spent their first year buying pints in the Dole Bar, and I have spent the first year of mine in my house in my pajamas on Zoom like everybody else.
Yeah, if Gavin, if you want to go next.
I only wish that I'd spent most of my first year buying pints in the Dole Bar. Regrettably, I'm not nearly sociable enough to volunteer for that. I'm Gavin Riley. I'm the political correspondent at Virgin Media News. That generally means that whenever there's a big lockdown announcement, I get the cushy job of standing inside where the weather and lighting is lovely, whereas Richard has to stand outside and get rained on because that's just how hierarchy works. I have been at Virgin for 3.5 years. Before that, I was the political correspondent at Today FM for 4 years. Yes, 4 years. And then before that, I was at the journal.ie. And before that, I was at the University Observer in UCD, which is actually where I met Richard for the first time. So we go quite a bit back. The last year has been mad because it is only a couple of weeks since the anniversary of the general election. And in any other year, the general election would be the most exhausting thing that you do all year. And we all thought, okay, right, it's a bit early and we would have liked a little bit more time to warm ourselves up after Christmas 2019. But okay, we're into an election, so let's do this. And ran ourselves into the ground thinking that by the time we got to the second week of February, we'd have the whole rest of the year to recover. And that is, spoiler alert, that's not how it worked out. And I don't think I can remember a year that was more singularly focused on a single thing, because even in the times that I was just getting into journalism and you're dealing with the banking crisis and the bailout and the troika arriving and everything that came with that, there were so many different strands to it, but there's never been a single story that's just as all encompassing as COVID and the pandemic. And it's just been really, like in bizarre ways, it's like a really rewarding, but mostly just a really exhausting 12 months, which I'm sure we'll get to in later Q&A. But that's me anyway.
Great. And Richard?
Yeah, I'm Richard Chambers. I'm news correspondent with Virgin Media, recently appointed. Yeah, before I joined Virgin, which was about coming up on 3 years ago now, I was in News Talk doing bits and bobs, reporting with the Pat Kenny show, and generally doing lots of reporting stuff as I do now, but with a title. And before that, freelanced in Today FM and just did, again, odd stuff until I got into journalism. So yeah, there's not a huge amount to it. I've just been doing news for the last 7-8 years and it's all the same, but this year has been particularly newsy, you know?
For sure. I think what we'll do now is we have a question for each of you individually, and then we have a good few topics that anyone can jump in on. But if we wanted to start with the individual questions, for Aoife, I think it's fair to say that you have an interesting perspective being from Derry, and trying to make sense of both the British and Irish governments and journalism, particularly in the time of Brexit. And I was just wondering what your experience has been with that.
I think what we find in Brexit is that the English view of who they are and how they're seen elsewhere is wrong. I think the view that Dublin has of people in the north, for the most part, is wrong. And I think we learned in Brexit that the north-south relationship had been neglected for an incredibly long time, and it came home to roost in Brexit and got considerably worse during COVID. And I think we're still feeling the effects of that now. I think the Good Friday Agreement, you know, Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair's input was monumental, and it wouldn't have got over the line without them. I think since the day it was signed, it has slipped, and the people who suffer the most are the people who live in the north. And, you know, I don't need to go over the statistics about the rates of poverty and unemployment and debt in the north. We know that. And that is because of neglect from Westminster, and it's because of neglect from Dublin. And a lot of the politics now, north and south, doesn't benefit anybody. And it's because there is a lack of knowledge. And that's not, you know, about, you know, Dublin and the unionist community. It's Dublin and the nationalist community as well, and the community of the in-betweens who probably will decide on the future of this island, to be honest. And I think just through Brexit, we have seen that everybody had a false kind of narrative about themselves and how important they were, and we're kind of bearing the brunt of it now. And we've seen, even with the EU and Article 16 and everything that's triggered, if there had been a lot more cooperation and a lot more conversation, then we mightn't be in the situation that we have. But this isn't an overnight thing. This has been festering for the last 10 to 20 years, and we're just bearing the brunt of it now.
Absolutely. Maggie, if you want
to. Thank you. The next question is for Richard. So the situation of the past year has really thrown into relief how important communication between the government and the public as a whole is. I think it's fair to say that you've probably been many people's primary source for COVID figures. You've been tweeting about the daily numbers every day for over a year now. So what is that experience like, sort of translating the government's announcements and press conferences into something understandable?
Yeah, I suppose there's two different strands to that. Like, there's the Department of Health side, which I would, like, the NPHET side of things in communications is kind of straightforward. At least, you know, every week you're going to have 2 press conferences, and they're going to release the daily updates daily by nature. So that's quite straightforward, I have to say. It's, I mean, it can be a stressful thing from a television point of view, because it is often, oftentimes it's right on our deadline for 5:30, so it's happening live. They're walking into the press conference room. You have Tony Houlihan and Ronan Glynn and all those guys walking past you, and you're basically given a sheet which you have to parse into relatable data, both online as well as on TV, in very quick fashion. So that's quite difficult. I suppose from the government communication standpoint, that has been challenging, and I'm sure the guys have their own views on that. There's been many lines have been floated by government ministers privately behind the scenes and have then been denied, perhaps even a few hours later. And then you have to try and explain rationales behind decisions. Like kites have been flown multiple times about what would be opening or what would be closing and how, to what degree things would be different ahead of announcements, and then trying to communicate things which people are automatically angry about is very difficult as well. When you're trying to explain the rationale for, or what the government's rationale is for certain decisions behind restrictions or loosening restrictions, and the instant response, particularly online, is WTF are you doing? Is really difficult. Sometimes that barrier between what a journalist is saying and the person actually making the decision seems to be quite blurred, which is quite interesting. I would say it has been difficult, and there's so many different elements to the question of around how do you go and communicate what's happening at government to the public, when internally communications in government have been brutal at times over the past year, and they would be, those issues are very well aired in both parliamentary parties. In fact, on a weekly basis, you have very loud complaints about communications, but it's been difficult to try and relay exactly what the government means and what it actually intends for different decisions to be. You see that in a lot of different things in terms of even testing and tracing and retrospective contact tracing, which you've had to explain, and public health experts are like, but we do that every day anyway. There's so many different elements to that. It's just, I would say that this year has been relentlessly difficult in trying to, explain things, because doing it, and actually the whole Twitter thing is actually probably my best way of doing it, is like whenever I'm live at a government press conference or briefing, when I'm doing live tweeting, people are like, oh, how are you always live tweeting these things? It's like, because that's my note-taking system. So like if I break things down into emoji-based bullet point lists, that is the easiest way for me to remember how to say things then at 5:30 or at 8 o'clock on the news bulletin, because it's just so convenient and short. So, I mean, it's been a real challenge to try and communicate so many different complex issues. Like even if you looked back at the New Living with COVID plan, there's so many different facets to that. And to be able to sort of, it's a real challenge both online and on television to try and communicate all of that information and how it's going to affect everybody's lives in a nice 1 minute and 30-second package, or in a few short tweets with a bit of, with some clarity. So it really has been a challenge right across the board.
For sure. Our next question is for Gavin, and it's actually, you brought this up earlier about last year's general election. I think it's fair to say that there was a massive shift in public opinion to a different party in last year's general election. It was kind of unlike any general election we'd seen before in recent years anyway. What was it like covering that in comparison to other elections you've covered? And was there a feeling of change on the ground? You're on mute.
Hey.
Now the obligatory one for every single thing. Finally, it happened. Let's just clear the text now. It's done. Let's get out of the way. We have had the tokenistic thing on you. The one thing I should say probably up front is that, and this is maybe a bit of a cardinal sin for a political correspondent to admit, is that I wasn't actually on the ground as much as perhaps I might have been perceived to be, or that I perhaps maybe ought to have been, because the way the things were structured in Virgin is that we had reporters on the ground who were trailing individual parties. Richard, for example, was trailing Fine Gael and Leo Varadkar and team for the entirety of the campaign. We had Rory Carroll trailing Fianna Fáil. We had Paul Quinn trailing Sinn Féin. And then we had Deborah Naylor trailing some of the other parties kind of on a bit of a rota. So I wasn't as much on the ground. But I think the big forgotten story, firstly, your question, how is it different to cover? It was my first time doing a general election for TV, which meant that you kind of had to have this kind of floating brief where if there was a big thing like a manifesto launch, like a real linchpin of a campaign, you would go there. But otherwise, you'd be on this kind of floating brain in a jar brief where you were supposed to be the central nerve station sitting beside Colette Fitzpatrick every day to fill some time on extended bulletins. The thing that I think is really overlooked about the election, and if COVID had not come up in the meantime, this would be like the thing you would talk about in 2020, would be how now we, like, I think possibly for the first time in genuinely 100 years, we actually have a Dáil that's kind of divided along the political spectrum that you would see in any other Western or developed democracy at all, where instead of having two center/center-right parties, even though Fianna Fáil has never really realized that that's what it is, the two of them in this kind of hop, skip and jump where they dance in and out of power, but are always trying to keep each other out of power. Now you have a situation where you've got two parties which have a broadly similar outlook on the world in power together. And you have a whole panoply of people. There's a small number of people who are to the right of them in the Dáil, but then they've got this whole spectrum of parties who are to the left of them. And it means that next time around, you're going to have an election between an outgoing centre-right coalition and a whole panoply of centre-left and left-wing parties who want to take over. And you've never really had that properly defined right versus left before, because you've always had this weird Punch and Judy duopoly of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil pretending that they don't really have a similar viewpoint, when in fact they kind of do. Irish politics is mostly defined by parties who have almost identical views on the future, who are slightly divided by really, really small disagreements over the past. You have Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are mostly divided by what they think about a war 99 years ago. Labour and the Social Democrats are mostly divided by what they think about Alan Kelly's water charges plans 6 years ago. The Solidarity and People Before Profit and Rise are mostly divided about whether you would have a fully Marxist or a slightly Marxist Trotskyist view of the revolution when it comes, whenever it will come. But mostly they kind of have pretty identical views around how the country should work. So now they're going to be divided mostly along that spectrum. And I think in a funny way, the answer to the question is that the big story of the election is how it's going to define the next election. But it means that for the first time ever, you have the legitimate prospect of there being a centre-left government in Ireland and all the things that brings, which, like, in a funny way for nerds like me, is actually quite exciting, because it just means that instead of having 100 years of different governments of the same flavour, like, you now actually have a proper menu in front of you. And I think that's the real overlooked thing from 2020.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. With that, I think I'll move on to kind of general topics, and anyone can jump in on these. We've spoken a bit about this, but just how the three of you have adapted to covering the COVID crisis. So you've had to adapt to public health coverage way more than normal, and learn about statistics or numbers, vaccination versus herd immunity, and all these kind of technical jargon. And I'm just wondering how you were prepared for that, and if so, how you've adapted to learning about all of that and then communicating it to the public.
I would say my first experience, well, my early sort of experiences on this were at the Department of Health, where you're trying to get your head around all the terminology around COVID-19. Like, I remember the first time I was asked to explain the R number was was right towards the end of a press conference at the Department of Health, and Philip Nolan is the guy from NEF who does all the modelling, and he said, oh, the R number is, I think it was like 3.2 or something at that point. It was something really high. And I think it was Gareth O'Connor, who's our producer for the 8 o'clock, was like, will you do a thing explaining the R number? We'll have a graphic explaining it behind you. And I was like, cool, how do I explain the R number? So what I actually, one of the most helpful parts of that was actually pulling up a clip from, what was that, the Matt Damon film Contagion, in which I think it was, I can't remember the actress's name, but she was great. She explained the R number really well on a whiteboard. And I was like, this is fantastic. I will relay this to the viewers of Virgin Media Television with some output or in other input from people who actually do know what they're talking about. So, like, I mean, the technical elements, which we all now take for granted, are very complex. Even issues around the efficacy of vaccines and whatnot. I do think that journalists do need to pause every so often and, reassure the public that they're not stupid for not understanding any of this, because none of us at a very deep level understand most of it, and if we do understand things of it, it's from assumed knowledge from people who've told us how it works. It's really difficult. It's unlike anything else. Like, I was actually, the way that Instagram and Facebook bring back your on this day last year memories? Like, it was last year when it was last week last year was when they were doing the whole thing of, we're cancelling the Ireland versus Italy rugby match. And I remember the level of outrage from some broadcasters and people at that. I remember one particular presenter of some programs tweeted out, just, what the fuck, about it, which I just found it just to look back at it. But that's it. That's the level of, we didn't know a huge amount of what coronavirus would mean. Now that person looking back at that tweet would be like, well, what the fuck was I thinking when I said that? So like, I mean, we've had to, everybody in the country has at least an understanding of some of the issues around this and the complexity of all of this. But I mean, we're still learning stuff every day, like particularly when it comes down to vaccine rollout and how many degrees can the Pfizer vaccine be stored at. Like, there's so many new bits to this that keep on coming up that it is hard. You do have to do some homework quite a lot on this.
The only other thing that I would say is that journalists, I think sometimes, like when you see people like Richard and Gav on TV and you think like, oh, they know everything. And for a lot of it, when you're at press conferences, I know, like from my own experience, this is in COVID, but also, for instance, I can't do maths. I can barely add. I know nothing about taxes or don't understand finance whatsoever. And I went to a number of press conferences with Pascal Donoghue in the last couple of years, and he would be explaining, these different things. And I used to be really, really afraid to ask a question because I'm like, right, my question's going to be stupid. And then like Pat Leahy from the Irish Times is here and he's going to laugh because I don't know what it is. And then after a while, I got to the point where I would just ask, what does this mean for the ordinary person? And because it's a question the politicians are going to want to answer, and it's also the easiest way to break it down. And I feel like in COVID, we've had a lot of that as well. It's actually something that I learned. I lived in Glasgow for years, and there was quite a number of things that happened when I lived there, but Rangers, the football club, went under administration when I was there. And overnight, I remember all the journalists around me, we had all become geniuses in administration and insolvency and, shareholders and how it all worked. Journalists pick stuff up quite quickly, but I would say for anyone who's training to be a journalist or wants to be a journalist, there is no harm in just asking the question, what does this mean to ordinary people? Can you break this down for us? Because assuming the people are that everyone in the room knows does nobody any service.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that one of the real skills, and I think Aoife's kind of put her finger on it, and it's nice to think that someone who sees Richard and myself on telly, that they might think that, God, we're fully schooled up. You have to go behind the scenes. You have to go and ask people, what does that mean? You have to talk to them about, what exactly does it mean if the IMF have a lien on certain state assets? Like, what is that? And eventually someone will explain to you, and then you're able to try and turn that into more digestible language afterwards. Like, in a funny way, the variety of it, not that there's been a huge amount of variety because it's just been all COVID for the last 12 months, but even within that, like as Richard points out, there's all the talk about, vaccine efficacy and the difference between efficacy and effectiveness, because there is a difference. And then variants and, oh God, the variants and all the different strains of variants, and where even the names like B117 and B1353, where they all come from. But like part of what's stimulating about the job is the kind of the crazy variety about it, because particularly in Leinster House, one of the first things that made me want to cover stuff in Leinster House is that everything goes through Leinster House. Like, if you care about same-sex marriage or repeal, like you might want to do a grassroots campaign, but ultimately it has to get through the vehicle of Leinster House before anything happens. If you care about teaching consent in second level or in third level, or if you care about the funding of higher education, or if you care about the reform of student grants, or if you care about animal rights or the environment, or legalizing e-scooters or banning scrambler or quad bikes, they all have to go through Leinster House at some stage. So like it's a great place for variety. It's a really kind of stimulating place to cover, but as a result you kind of do end up having to be this jack of all trades. So you do have to have no fear in calling up someone who knows better and just asking what might be the real dunce questions, because if you just try to just bat your eyelids and just go, oh, I know what I'm talking about, and you don't really know what you're talking about, eventually you're going to be unstuck and
you'll be so found out.
And then you'll be the Minister for Health on 2FM saying it was called COVID-19 because there were 18 other COVIDs.
It's actually funny that Gavin mentioned like that about like the variants and how they all got names and whatnot. I was actually in the National Virus Reference Lab in UCD there last week, and I've never had an experience where I couldn't understand as many things in just such a short space of time. I was surrounded by the best scientists going through how genome sequencing works, and I still couldn't tell you a single damn thing about it. I just had to ask them straight up multiple times, how can you explain this so that I can explain this to people so that they'll understand what your job is and why it's so important? And that's not easy at all.
Not at all, for sure. Maggie, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, in this kind of situation, well, I'm sure you're used to covering sort of political debates, but when the debates have the scientific element to them, I think there's an extra level of responsibility in reporting on them because you want to get the facts right. And when there are disagreements, say, between NPHET and the government on how to proceed, trying to communicate that to the public and what that means is probably has an added degree of difficulty to it. So can I sort of ask about how you tackle that responsibility?
It's a very, very difficult one to handle, I think, because although the true structure is that government make the decisions, that NPHET offer advice, and before Christmas they got advice from loads of other people. They get advice from Ernst & Young, and you commission them from all these other people, and you have all these other independent scientific lobbyists all trying to have their say. It's the government that makes the decisions. And yet, because 12 months ago we were just flying blind and we didn't know very much about anything at all, and Tony Holohan was very calm and very considered and very clinical and very comforting on telly, NPHET sort of became almost perceived like they were kind of a second government, or that it was just another arm of government, that it didn't matter what cabinet thought because Tony Holohan thought differently. And it can actually be very difficult to try and explain to people when you're talking about disagreements between them, trying to always make sure that they still know in their heart of hearts that it's the government that makes the call. So, obviously it was exposed pretty bluntly at the end of November when NPHET were expressing concerns around allowing hospitality while also allowing people to visit each other's homes. But if you have other sort of smaller disagreements along the way, like whether you should have mandatory quarantine for all international travelers, which NPHET was looking for last May or June, and the government rebuffing that, sometimes the viewers can think that actually that might mean that you now have two different arms of government going against each other, and that it's actually some kind of constitutional crisis. And actually trying to make it clear to people that no, it's not that. It's just that the experts have a different view on things, and that NPHET only has a fairly narrow remit, that it's not NPHET's job to worry about how exactly the CAO is going to work if you don't have physical Leaving Cert exams. NPHET's job is to figure out whether it's safe to put 100 teenagers into a school hall or a school gym or an assembly room at the same time. And trying to explain to people that there's actually slightly different functions, I think, is quite important, because otherwise they will think that if Tony Holohan or Ronan Glynn disagrees with what Stephen Donnelly or Micheál Martin have to do, that the government is on the brink of collapse and that you're going to be having a general election or martial law in the morning. It's actually just as I mentioned martial law, it's actually really important that people do, without getting too much into the whole like CSPE class of it, that people do kind of understand the structures, because one of the difficulties we have, and this thought struck me when you were asking Richard the first question earlier on, sometimes there are so many voids in how you deal with COVID, and you're waiting so long for there to be a new development. Nature abhors a vacuum, and people want to try and fill the void with speculation. But unless you try to have informed speculation, or unless you talk to people who have genuine insight into how things are going to go, if you don't fill those voids, you're going to have people who just pop on WhatsApp and just announce that there's going to be parading in the barracks at 0600 hours, and that the Taoiseach is going to announce a status red emergency at 0900 hours.
Pack your bags, it's like code red, guys.
Right, and your Berksons, or what were they called, the weird kind of rucksacks that they have, and it was using all that kind of military language. And if you don't explain the structures and make sure that people understand that government is in charge, and not Conor McGregor and Vice Admiral Mark Mellett and Commissioner Drew Harris and all these people, that they kind of do have to understand who's in charge, irrespective of what the disagreements and policy might actually be. That's a total tangent. It doesn't necessarily answer your question, but it's just a point that I really wanted to make.
It's a good point, anyway.
Well done, Gav.
Follow on from that, actually. Also, obviously, the government is ultimately responsible for these decisions it makes about how to deal with the pandemic. How do you hold the government accountable in a situation where national unity is so important, and it's important that people have faith in sort of the, the ability of the government to protect them and their families, but that government is making some decisions that might not be the best ones. Specifically, I think I wanted to ask about breaking the story of Gulfgate in August, and in general, the missteps the government has made along the way. What is it like to cover that in this sort of crisis situation?
I would say, I think you make a good point. I've heard this question before. I would say the conflating national solidarity and not criticising the government is incredibly dangerous. I think we all do need to work together when it comes to lockdown. We all need to abide by the rules. That does not mean that the government gets a free pass to make mistakes and not be held accountable for them. Seen mistakes were made now at Christmas, and they did not enjoy being held to account about it. We saw it on TV, we heard it on radio, we saw it in the papers. The government were not willing at first to admit that they had done anything wrong. And it was only after a couple of weeks where Micheál Martin said, yeah, okay, we wouldn't go back and we wouldn't do it again. And not everyone gets access to the politicians, and we are the go-between between politicians. And at times when we're in press conferences, we are telling politicians things like, this message is confusing. And they'll say, no, it's not confusing. It's the press that's making it confusing. Or we'll say, well, you got it wrong here. And they'll say, no, we didn't get it wrong. The press is the go-between.
The people were the ones who spread the virus.
Got it wrong. So the press is the go-between between the public and the politicians. And we are as much the voice of the public when we're talking to the politicians as relaying the message back to the public when we speak to politicians. And I think I get really annoyed about this notion of like, we need to pull on the green jersey because we all are in it together. That's absolute nonsense. And if Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and the Greens were in opposition, they would absolutely be holding Sinn Féin and the Social Democrats and whoever else in government to account for the mistakes they made. So I think it's a dangerous conflation, and I've heard it before. Everybody makes mistakes. We're like, well, we also pay our taxes so they know, and we elect them to know what they're doing. So you have to be held accountable for your mistakes. It's like a job. If you worked in Tesco's and you made a mess of it, you'd be getting pulled up too. So I don't know why you would get an easier go of it when you're the leader of the country. And I think there is a limited amount of sympathy. We saw, how the public feeling turned towards Simon Harris last year. Simon Harris, the reason we had an election is because they didn't think Simon Harris was going to survive a vote of no confidence. He became this new Simon Harris in the pandemic. Everyone was learning on their feet. The public opinion completely changed of him. I actually think the opposition's opinion changed of him during the pandemic as well to a degree. And I think there is a level of sympathy from the public that everyone is learning on their feet. There was then, there is not now. There is no patience left with the public. There have been too many mistakes made, especially at Christmas. People really want out of their houses, and we're seeing what's happening in other countries, and we're seeing people or other leaders who have been better at the job than what we're seeing here, and people want accountability. And I think just the other thing about Gulfgate, I think Gavs and Richard have both been on loads of Zooms with me where I've had to tell the story, so they're probably sick of it. But I think Gulfgate happened in a context, like the time that Gulfgate happened had so much to do with the public opinion about Gulfgate. Everyone was really, really pissed off at the time. There was this notion of like, it's them and us, like the government makes the rules, but they don't want to abide by the rules. And it fed into a narrative that people already had, that the government didn't really care about them. I don't believe that that's true, but it fed a narrative that was already there, that the Supreme Court judges and the politicians and the commissioners and senators, they all go play golf together and they all go for their dinner, and the rules are just for the little people. And everyone had been at home, everyone had been locked in their houses, people had missed funerals and weddings and whatever else, and a lot of people had died. And I just think the public were teetering on the edge, and something had to happen, and Gulfgate happened. I don't think it's going to play an issue in the next election. I think it'll be long gone in the public psyche by then. It was just the perfect thing at the perfect time. It fed every narrative that people already believed, and it was at a tipping point for public outrage. And there was this feeling, and I think there has been a feeling for a long time in Irish politics, that there is not enough accountability. I would say you should try being from the north where nobody resigns about anything, but
every party has to be in government and you're not even be in opposition.
Everybody, it's great. It's like, it's a participation trophies. Everybody gets to be in government and you never have to resign no matter what you do. But I think there had been a feeling that there wasn't enough accountability in government for a long time. That paired with the fact that it was a Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael led government. So people had already been annoyed. If you spent your life annoyed at Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, then they're in government again, then in a pandemic, you already feel like there's no accountability, and then Golfgate happens. It's not going to be this lasting thing at the ballot box. It was just the perfect thing at the perfect time for the Irish public.
There was one thing I think, actually, the more I hear Aoife on Zooms talk about this, the more I think I realized that I think actually one of the things that Golfgate really did, particularly because of this whole defense around pulling a partition in a function room and turning a group of 80 into 2 groups of 40, the one thing that it kind of really fermented was this culture of like loopholism, where suddenly now everyone was looking for some way in which the rules didn't apply to them. Because, like, let's face it, like lockdown and all the restrictions that we're under, they're just really inconvenient. And suddenly then people were suddenly going, right, well, first time around, they were prepared to stay at home because they were petrified of this virus that might legitimately kill them and all the people that they love. Second time around, they were like, well, hang on, if I'm allowed to go more than 5 kilometers to visit a grave, then why don't I go to the grave and all of my friends and family go to the grave at the same time? Or why don't we all go and do our shopping in Lidl at exactly the same moment? And suddenly everyone goes looking for the get out clauses. And I think, like, the funny thing about the green jersey agenda is that while, it kind of fell into a lot of the populist political tropes that Aoife mentioned, it suddenly meant now that everyone felt like, well, if it's all right to pull a partition now across a group of 80 and turn it into 2 groups of 40, then I can get away with all these other small things which are against the, they're in compliance with the letter of the law, but they're totally against the spirit of it. And the problem with the virus is that, generally speaking, if people start taking liberties that they're not supposed to in the spirit of the law, the virus doesn't know whether you are in full compliance with, statutory instrument 709 of 2020. The virus cares that you're in company of someone else, and that's how it gets out. And I think that was one of the real unfortunate legacies, is that it just gave people license to do a little bit more of whatever they wanted and screw the consequences.
Absolutely. That actually leads on to my next topic really well, about the changes in public attitude and how that's changed your coverage of the pandemic over time. So obviously recently we all saw what happened in Dublin city centre with the riots, and especially with the rise of social media, there's been a lot of misinformation, and the public's response to new restrictions, to any news about the pandemic, has really changed over the last year as the lockdowns have got harder and longer, and the weather has gotten colder, and it feels like we're right back where we started. So I'm just wondering how it's been for you and the response to your coverage over time, and have you really seen that?
I think you kind of have to be careful about it, because I actually genuinely believe that the vast majority of people, and those public opinion surveys will always show it as well, that people can be massively pissed off with these things, but they all abide by it anyway for the vast majority. And I do think that's still the case. And I actually, like, people, you do hear these anecdotal things of like, oh, sure, everybody's breaking the rules now these days. And I'm like, are they? I just don't see it. I just don't see it. You do get more, like, I mean, I always give pause before I sort of talk about, the reaction on social media is more negative these days, or you get more conspiracy theorists in your replies calling me like in the pocket of big pharma about vaccines and stuff like that, when I don't know one end of a syringe from another. But it is an element, and the misinformation side of things has been allowed to flourish. It's been allowed to flourish by those sort of vacuums you talked about earlier on. And people will use it, and Aoife and Paul Hosford actually did great stuff on this as well, about the fact that, like, the far right in this country are using frustration with lockdown and with this whole pandemic and disaffection with people losing their jobs to recruit people for big rallies and sort of give them the bit on the side about, well, here's what's really happening as well. Like, this is all part of a bigger plan. And there's some excellent Irish journalists and researchers who do excellent stuff on this. But I just don't think that there's everybody's really annoyed and fed up with the lockdown restrictions at this point. I know I am. I don't see my family. I don't see my girlfriend at all these days. But I do think that generally people are sort of looking at this as something which is, people do feel let down. They feel like, here, we're still being asked to do this, and they're looking across the UK at everybody getting vaccinated and hearing that the Reading Festival is on this year, and they're like, why is that not here? But I do think people are just sticking out with it. I do think you can focus too much on the people giving it lip online, but I mean, there's a dangerous side to that, and that's what you see when you see the riots happening in Dublin, and plans for further ones on St. Patrick's Day. But it's something you do have to be mindful of and monitor very closely, because it can be quite a dangerous thing. But I do still feel that it is quite a fringe element as well.
Absolutely. If either of you other two want to come in on that.
No, I nailed it, but you don't need to.
You've covered all bases.
Thanks, Rachel.
I think that's really interesting. I think the news of vaccines has really impacted that, because people do seem to have this attitude now of, well, if we just stick with it, vaccines are. And I think it's really important when you see all of you reporting vaccination numbers and that kind of glimmer of hope, and people seeing their grandparents getting vaccinated. And I think I'm just wondering, have you seen that in your vaccine coverage? Has there been a nicer tone, I suppose?
I thought you were going to ask us if we had been vaccinated.
I thought that's where it was going.
So I just want to ask if you had been vaccinated. Have you skipped the queue?
I would say, yeah. Go ahead, Aoife. Yeah.
Oh no, did the man want to talk again? Yeah, I would just say vaccines, you're completely right. Vaccines has completely changed the tone. People are just delighted. Like, I don't know how many times I've seen people on my social media saying, if you're getting your vaccine, can you please post a picture of it so I can see you getting your vaccine and see your grannies getting the vaccine, so that, it just gives people that wee lift. Like, the replies are still horrendous, but and the numbers are so slow. Like, we know the rollout is so slow. Every week we're being told we're going to miss targets. AstraZeneca, I don't know, they must send us like one a week, and it really gets people down. But that is like so short-lived. When we do get, even if the numbers are going up slightly, even seeing the number goes up every day, people are so much more delighted. And I think the main thing now isn't so much the vaccine numbers, it's we are seeing deaths and nursing home cases and ICU and hospital cases and healthcare workers getting sick going down. And that's the kind of stuff people really react to, like the notion, because I remember at the height of it, I was at a press conference and Pierce Doherty from Sinn Féin told us that a nursing home in his constituency had half of the residents die of COVID that week. We were in like the height of it. And this nursing home had 26 residents and 13 or 14 of them had died of COVID. And I remember it was like the height of the nursing homes. And people were it was just awful at the time. It was so depressing. And I really think when we see, nursing home numbers going down, healthcare workers aren't getting as sick anymore, and the hospital cases are going down, it does completely give people a lift. It really is, as corny as it sounds, it's totally like the light at the end of the tunnel. And like, people who are garbage online are always going to be garbage, but the good people are really lifted by stuff like this.
I would say, yeah, like, I mean, that's been my experience of it. I was in the Phoenix Park at one of their vaccination centers for healthcare workers, and that was a really lovely, it was one of those rare days where you just come away with a really nice buzz from it, because it was interesting, because I think something like 1,000 healthcare workers were being vaccinated, getting their second doses or their first doses that day. And it was really cool, because like, I got to bump into a lot of, whether they be hospital doctors or nurses or GPs who'd been in touch with me throughout the last year. And a lot of them had bared their souls and just the awful things that were happening in their hospitals and their wards and in their GP surgeries for the last year, and to be able to sort of be around them when this really sort of landmark change in things was happening, it was very emotional. It was very overwhelming for me as well as for them as well. It was just such a relief. And even in like over the last week, a lot of my coverage has been on GPs and how difficult it has been for them to get vaccines. But you sort of put out call outs on Twitter, and you ask people about their experiences with their grannies and their granddads not getting done. And then the next day they'll come back and said, Eureka, my granny and granddad both got done there yesterday. And like they'll have a little photo and stuff like that. And it's just that snap from the worry and the anxiety of the last year, and even it's amplified in the last days before you actually know you're going to get a vaccine, and then it just happens, and it's just this great washing over of relief. That's been really rewarding, and that's why I hope things go a lot faster now than they have been, because that's just a really great feeling. And to see that happen to so many people that I know and have huge respect for, and who've been really kind to share their stories with us, that's just really, it's a beautiful thing, to be honest.
I think part of what makes the whole vaccine thing though frustrating is that, you know, some of the countries that are doing so much better than us, as it happens that they're all either fully English speaking or mostly English speaking countries. So it's like the US or the UK or Israel. And it just makes things so frustrating, because I think like people have had such different experiences around the world of just how bad the pandemic has been in each of their countries. You know, like none of us, thankfully, were in Bergamo or Lombardy for the last 12 months to see just what it was like at its absolute worst in North Italy. And, you know, it's easy then to forget, because we haven't had firsthand experience of what it's been like in other jurisdictions. You know, we haven't been in New York to see hospital ships sailing into your harbor because of how bad it's been. We don't live in mainland Britain to see just how many deaths there were. And it's easy to forget that. But, you know, the downsides are so subjective, and yet normality is objective. So when you see other countries which are on the cusp of being able to go back to normality, whether it's the right thing or not for Texas to decide that there's no more restrictions anymore, that it just gets so much more frustrating to see other countries get there quicker. But it's because you forget that actually some of the countries that have, you know, are getting out of there quicker are also the ones that really just cratered last April and May in ways that thankfully we didn't. But part of just what makes it so frustrating is that there's now so much focus on, oh, how come, you know, Northern Ireland and Britain, they're all getting out of things so much quicker than the rest of us. And, you know, Boris Johnson now suddenly looks like the savior of the Western world, when in actual fact, he's presided over like the worst mortality rate in Europe. And now suddenly no one cares because you're going to be able to go to a pub on July the 21st.
Can I just also say that it has been, you know, of my 29 years on Earth, it is actually the first time where people have said, oh my God, I am so jealous of people in the north. It's like your vaccine rollout is so
you
fast.
Get the vaccines and we get the better potatoes, and that's just the social contract, you know?
We're going to be open sooner. It's a rare thing to have people say that to you, somebody from the north. So that's been good.
I think we just have a couple more questions, and then we might take some questions from the audience if anyone wants to sort of submit those into the Q&A function. Just some forewarning for the audience. But yeah, so I mean, we've talked about sort of seeing people getting their vaccines on social media. Obviously, social media is huge right now because we're all stuck at home, and it's our, you know, main means of communicating. And you've mentioned earlier that, you know, when you're reporting bad news, kind of it can become the target of the anger that people have about that, and as well these sort of extreme views that circulate more online, you know, can also sort of seek to undermine journalists and undermine kind of traditional media. So I just wanted to ask about sort of what has your experience been of that kind of like harassment maybe, and that kind of anger being directed towards you.
My experience is that George Soros pays really, really well. So all of the abuse is totally worth it. Yeah, like it's weird kind of being like that kind of collateral damage. Richard kind of touched upon it earlier on that, you know, we're kind of, you know, in this role where when you're in the press conference, you are the voice of the public. And then when you go and you address the camera back afterwards, after the press conference, suddenly you kind of, you know, you're not trying to become the voice of the government, but like, this is a health emergency. So you're trying to underline whatever it is that is necessary to try and, you know, safeguard people's health. And it's a really, really difficult balance to cross, particularly when you're doing one of those marathon live things where you're standing and you're addressing the minister and you're saying things on behalf of the public, and then you turn around to the camera and say things on behalf of the government again straight away. So it can be really difficult for people not to just mistake you as being some sort of establishment shill, that you're just some, like the Bluetooth speaker for whatever it is that Stephen Donnelly wants to get out into the public, or whatever Tony Holohan really wants to say that day. And some of the communications that end up coming into your way are pretty horrible. There was one point, I think, last May or June. Like I've been on Twitter since 2007. Like I've been on Twitter since way before it was cool. Basically, like I was on Erasmus. Cool. Well, it was never cool, not true. And I will never be on TikTok for that reason. I think I joined Twitter for 2007 because I was on Erasmus in Germany, but it was back in the day when Twitter would text you. Because there were so few people on it that whenever someone posted a new tweet, it would be texted to you. And I wanted to get updates for the general election in 2007. So I joined Twitter so that I'd end up getting onto my phone while I was on Erasmus. So like I've been around for a long time. And like last year was the first time in like the 13 years that I've been on it then, where there was a weekend where I was like, I just can't deal with the amount of like frontline opprobrium that you're getting back from people who think that either you are the establishment shill who's trying to kill all of their fun and trying to, hide the scandal of nursing homes and trying to keep people away from their families, or alternatively that by casting any kind of critical, view of what the government is doing, that you are somehow undermining the message and encouraging people to go out and rave on the streets. Like it was a unwinnable thing. And I think like all you can do is just remind yourself that it's just a really, really shit time for everybody, and that occasionally you're just going to find yourself being an emotional punchbag for people who are finding it kind of shit, and that it's not because there's any major plot to go out and discredit and destroy you. It's just because, unfortunately, when you are the bringer of news for the last 12 months, most of the time it's been the bringer of bad news, and that's just your lot in life. And there'll be some good news sometimes. You'll get to stand in front of a camera and announce that no more restrictions, anyone, electric picnic is on. But until those days, you're just going to have to, unfortunately, be the channel through which people get a lot of shitty news, and that's just the lot of journalism, unfortunately.
I obviously find it a bit different because I'm not the emotional punch bag because people are having a hard time. I am an emotional punch bag because people hate women. Yep. So the abuse that Richard and Gav get is obviously going to be a bit different from the abuse I get. Female journalists, especially female political journalists, get it a lot worse than the males do. It's a lot more targeted. It's a lot more sexualized. It's a lot more, they'll pick something about you. So for me, it tends to be because I'm from the north. So obviously all that comes with that. But I know for other female journalists, it could be their weight. It could be how they look. It could be, it's always kind of, what's the word? Like gendered insults. So, like stupid bitch and, stuff like that. And then if you're either an ugly bitch or you're a bimbo because you wouldn't get the job if you weren't good looking. So you can't win. You can't be good looking, but you can't be ugly either. And so I think it's gotten 10 times worse for me in the last year. That is probably a mixture of just a bigger profile than I had before when I was at PA. And also there's a lot more people sitting in the house that are really angry. And they're not going to give it out to Gavin, Richard, but they might give it out to me because it's just easier to target a woman if you're a man. I have to say, like, with my hand on my heart, if I get one negative tweet from a woman a month, considering how many negative tweets I get, like, it is by far in a way very angry men. And even the trolls who are anonymous or pretend to be women, it's quite clear that they are men. It's always too sexualized for any woman to send to another woman. So yeah, it's definitely a lot worse now than it ever was. I've spoken to older journalists that are older than me, female journalists that are older than me, and they've said, in the last year, it's just gotten to a point, like it's nearly at a tipping point, and Twitter and Facebook, well, I'm not on Facebook, but Twitter and will meet with every newspaper. They are meeting with every newspaper. They're meeting with every channel, and they're saying that they're doing this, that, and the other to help journalists, female journalists, do their job. But they are not in any way doing anything substantial enough that female journalists don't get up every morning and roll their eyes before they open their phone because they know of a barrage of shit is going to be there every day.
I agree. That's like, I mean, I didn't know if you were waiting for me to answer. I don't know why you are, because like I have nothing to add. The abuse that is directed at me or my male colleagues on social media is nothing compared to what it is for journalists who are women or who are people of color. And I just feel massively unqualified to talk about it then because of that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I feel like that came across as if I was waiting for a man to say it. So
But no, to be fair, like our colleague Zara King, like it was really instructional to watch some of the reaction when she famously asked one of the questions of Tony Houlihan, when are we going to be allowed to go back to our hairdressers? When can we go get our cut and color? And she asked the question, and Tony, gave her the straightforward answer, which is that it's too early to tell. And like basically like Twitter just completely devolved back into its gendered hemispheres where like all the men were like, stupid fucking bimbo questions, ridiculous, you're asking Tony Houlihan, it's a serious pandemic, what the fuck you doing asking about haircuts? And like the women were like, well, thank it, at least somebody fucking asked, because I desperately want my cut and color. So it's kind of like, it's terrible how Twitter could just go back to its like polarized bases when you ask questions like that. But like it was a very, very cold reminder to those of us who don't get quite the same level of abuse, just how bad it can be when you ask a question which is relevant to 50% of the population,
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that it's clear that female journalists are held to a different standard than male journalists. I think that's really interesting and great that Gavin and Richard, you acknowledge that, and it's very clearly a very big problem. Still, when people these days seem to like to pretend that sexism is a thing of the past, but clearly, Aoife, in your experiences, it very much isn't.
Yeah, and I just would say as well, and I actually don't think I get it as bad as some other people do, which is even more depressing. I know other women, I know, for instance, Sorcha Pollock, who does unbelievable work for the Irish Times about direct provision, and the targeted campaign against her has actually moved off social media at some points about her religion. There's a lot of anti-Semitic tripe, fake accounts have been made in her name, stuff like that. And it's like I said, if they could pick one thing out about you and they'll use that to target you. So for me, it's a lot of really sectarian bile, and say for Sorcha Pollock, it's anti-Semitic, and for other journalists, some of it is like so ridiculous. You're a D4 feminist. A journalist once said to a journalist I know who's from Meath. So it's just anything and everything. And I have to say that male journalists, for the most part, are really supportive. I don't think there's any man who works in journalism who claims that they get the same amount of abuse as the woman. I don't think they'd feel strong enough to say it. Morgan. Except Piers Morgan, the real victim of cancel culture today, guys. But yeah, it's the worst part of the job, but it definitely doesn't put me off the job. And I would say to any women who are thinking of getting into journalism that you should absolutely do it, because if I can do it, anybody can do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it must be really, I think, difficult, like being pigeonholed as sort of a journalist covering women's issues. If that's your focus, or being pigeonholed as a female journalist, even if you're not specifically, because those topics are so often not treated as seriously because they are considered women's issues. And I know that you do cover a lot of issues that are related to sort of women's healthcare in Ireland, or women's status in Ireland. And I just wonder, do you feel like you're taken less seriously because those are seen as women's issues, despite the fact that that's 50% of the population?
Well, we know that women's issues have always been put on the back burner in Ireland because cervical check happened, because the mother and baby homes happened. We could list off a million things that have happened in Ireland that just prove that women have been second-class citizens in this country for a really long time. We know in COVID that we're going to bear the brunt of recession, we're going to bear the brunt of childcare. We know that we're pushed out of the job market because childcare is like a second mortgage for people. And if for 1 second the government thought that men might not be able to access the jobs marketplace because of childcare, childcare would be state subsidised. And the only way that that is going to change is if we elect more women under the Dáil and we have more female journalists holding the government to account, because as much as you might have solidarity from your male colleagues, it's not the same. The lived experience isn't the same, and they can't understand sexism because it hasn't happened to them. And for instance, like I did a story about sexual harassment and spoke to a number of politicians, female politicians who had been sexually harassed, and I know for a fact that they would not have told me their stories if a male journalist who came to them and said, please tell me your traumatic story about being sexually harassed. So women's issues are put on the back burner. I don't feel like I'm pigeonholed into women's issues, and I think I actually find these stories get as much traction online as the male stories do, which is really, really heartening. And I think childcare especially is going to be the main thing, because men are also affected by the lack of childcare in Ireland and how expensive it is. And as Ireland becomes a more equal society, eventually, we're only going to see more of that. But I am the biggest champion of more women in politics, because nothing's going to change without more women being elected.
Thank you. So I think we might move on to the questions from the audience, because I think there are a few. So the first one I can see here is, was there an experience that made you particularly passionate about being a journalist or appreciate the job?
There's probably, for me, there's two answers to this, and the first one actually is what we're going through right now, because like part of the nerdy privilege of this job is that you kind of get to be on the front line of history, but that you also, like, the responsibility and the kind of the gratitude you get when you ask what people think is a relevant question in the middle of a press conference about how the country is going back into lockdown and 500,000 people are going to lose their jobs. And if you are a capable or a useful vehicle for what the public want to ask, and then simultaneously a useful vehicle for getting whatever the point of a press conference is, being able to boil it down into 2 or 3 bullet points and to be able to clearly impart that on telly, that's really valuable. The other thing, I suppose, that made me really appreciate it is what was happening just when I got into journalism, because it was 2010 when I got my first full-time job outside of the college paper where I met Richard. And like it was a really, really wild time, because we had like a massive 4-year budget in September 2010. The banks went into meltdown in October 2010. The Troika arrived in November 2010. The government collapsed in December 2010. There was a general election in February 2011. The government was formed in March 2011, 10 years ago today, actually. Enda Kenny became Taoiseach. And then there was loads more austerity and bailouts of banks in April 2011. So there was a huge amount going on. And just the ability to try and parse all of the stuff that was going on and to boil it down into something that was relatable or understandable was, at the time, a really, really important thing. It was something that, if you were able to do really well, or with any kind of quality at all, was something that you could feel proud about the day's work you were doing, because there was just so much going on. And I was lucky that was a thing that was going on just when I was getting into the trade, because if I was in any doubts about whether I was doing the right thing, the sense of fulfillment you got from doing meaningful work those days was enough to convince you were on the right track.
I would say before COVID, and COVID has been a hugely sort of, if you're not passionate about the job that you're doing in journalism during this, then you never will. I'd say before this, you sort of, in my previous job in News Talk, I was able to take on a few different passion projects. One thing I did was I did a series of reports for the Pat Kenny show on domestic abuse and domestic violence, which is an issue which is very close to my own heart. And to be able to sort of take on a lot of the stories that I heard and to sort of, feed them through, tell them in a responsible way, bring a spotlight onto the issue that wasn't there at the time. And it really, you've seen over the last couple of years, there has been more political response to it. It's been more societal appreciation of how big of an issue it is. Being able to do that at the time on something which was a little bit less heralded at the time was very rewarding. Some of the outcomes from it were amazing as well. A lot of people were coming forward to Women's Aid who didn't before. A lot of the local refuges that we featured in those reports had additional donations. I keep in close contact with a lot of them as well, which has been really rewarding as well. Like even just the other day, I don't know if people saw it. It's actually just yesterday it was confirmed. West Cork Women Against Violence project, they got a donation of €400,000. And when you see how much work has gone into places like that, and just how much money €400,000 is to a group of volunteers in Bantry, it's incredible. And just so the connections that you make along the way can be very, very, they're something worth getting passionate about, and they're a constant reminder to do the job that you're doing very well, because there will be people whose lives can benefit from it if you do a good job repeatedly.
Yeah, so I think just to go on after what Gav said earlier about, everything goes through Leinster House, and that's the way I kind of think about it, is that policies kind of dictate what kind of lives people are going to have. And for a long time in Irish society, a lot of people have been left behind. And I think probably one of the biggest things that people, at the time, I didn't think it was that, I thought it was good, but at the time I didn't really think about it. And the story that people keep coming back to me, I actually spoke to someone on the phone today about illegal adoptions, and she happened to bring up, I did a story a while back, a special report about the harassment of single mothers on social welfare. For anyone who doesn't know, because a lot of people did not know about this and contacted me after to say how disgusted they were. But in Ireland, if you're in receipt of lone parent payment, there are special inspectors who will come to your house to make sure you don't have a boyfriend or a live-in partner, because if you do, they're going to take your single parent payment off you. This can often be just one man who comes to the door. A lot of the time, the women are not aware of their rights and they are already vulnerable. The men have come into their houses, they have gone through their knicker drawers, they have searched their house. I spoke to a lot of women for that report, and I have always known about the social welfare inspector. I come from a working class community and there was always social welfare inspectors around. I was shocked at some of the things I was told. And then you go and you find that for a monetary value for the government, the money claimed back from these inspections is tiny. It's a fraction. If you were actually to inspect people on the old age pension, they are more likely to be paid out money that they're not due. And reviews have found that. But I think it was a big reflection of Ireland and the so-called modern Ireland, that we're not actually that different from when we were persecuting people and putting them in mother and baby homes. There's still this society and this stigma, because the social welfare inspector is also not going out looking for the dads of these children and asking them, why are you not paying their child support? But they are going to the mother's houses and asking them, are you sure you don't have a boyfriend? Because if you have a boyfriend and he lives with you and he works, then we're going to take your money away. So I think being able to, for a national broadsheet newspaper that I'm in now, to bring to people who might not know about it, you might be lucky enough that you've never encountered a social welfare inspector in your life, but taxpayers' money is being spent on this, and it's basically just harassment. And it's one of those stories that actually a TD came to me and said, when I was a councillor, there was women in my constituency who were so afraid of the social welfare inspector, they used to ask me to come and sit in their house with them when they knew he was coming, because they didn't know their rights and they were so worried about it. And he said, I never thought once about going to a newspaper about this. I never once thought this was news. I never thought people would care. And I just think being able to show what Ireland is actually like and where money is being spent, and it's working class communities that are usually bearing the brunt of bad policy. I think stories like that are always like the most, you get the most heart out of. And other than that, I would just say for me, the working on the Stardust campaign and working with the families of the Stardust Justice campaign has been incredibly emotional, but incredibly fulfilling as well. It's something that's pretty close to my heart, just because they remind me so much of my family and the Bloody Sunday Justice campaign in Derry. They're just normal working class people who had tragedy visited upon them, and they just want some justice and answers. And yeah, that's just the stories that are pretty close to my heart, really, more than an actual time in journalism that I'm proud of.
Incredible. I'm not sure. I can't see the Q&A function, but we might be out of time now anyway.
Yeah.
That's really incredible to hear about how it's not only that you're this go-between between the government or between NEFIT and the public. You also get the chance to platform social movements that are not only important to you, but to shine a light onto them so that the public can realize their importance as well. I think that's really incredible. So yeah, unless you have anything else to add, Maggie.
Just one little point on that idea, by the way, is that it not only is there like the real value of being able to shine a light on social movements like that, but it's also something which is slightly harder to do on TV because of the particular licensing constraints that we have. That like somebody will wave a red flag at us if we decide one day that we want to cover a campaign about even a couple of years ago, before it was more mainstream, if you wanted to decide to cover the period poverty, you'd have complaints about, well, how come you're not covering the side of the tampon industry and how they're going to be marginalized by addressing this. That there'll always be someone who kind of waves a stick at you to claim about false balance. So it's a lot harder to do some of those things in broadcast, which is the value of having multiple different formats, because sometimes people will wonder, especially when so much of the news is public health related, they'll wonder, well, why would you bother having newspapers when you've already got broadcast outlets that can tell you some of the same stuff with greater immediacy? But the value of having different formats is that they can approach things in different ways. And if there wasn't papers, then you wouldn't be able to have the sort of social movements that Aoife and her colleagues get to cover.
That's incredible to hear about. Unless Maggie or any of you have anything else to add, I'd just like to thank you all so much for coming and spending this hour and a bit with us. It's been great. It's been such all of your answers to all of the questions have been really, really insightful into you personally, and also the importance of journalism, not just in times of crisis, but in general, as a functioning tool of any democracy. But yeah, I just want to thank you all so much for that. And
thanks for having us. Yeah.
Thank you for responding to the email.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answers to our questions this evening, and for a really interesting discussion. Thanks to the people who submitted questions as well. Yeah, I think so. We'll wrap up here. We have a bunch of panel discussions here now. This is the part where I have to plug all the Hist events. I'm sorry. We have a panel discussion tomorrow on French cinema, and on Friday on activism in sport, organised by the Robinson Subcommittee. And our debate tomorrow evening is also on the subject of journalism. The House believes that journalism is failing democracy. So lots more discussion in future. And for more tireless updates on the state of the world and the country, I'm sure you can follow all our panelists on Twitter. Yeah, just thank you very much again for being here this evening.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us, guys.
Thanks.
I have 4 missed calls from my editor, so now I have to go. Panic. Goodbye.
What did you tell the Hist? You take that back.
Okay, goodbye.